Okay, so welcome to the Archery Equipment Inspection class. I am Tim Lightfellow. I am a member of the Order of the OGGS, Order of the Grey Goose Shaft. I am Kingdom Scores Deputy and Chief Archer for the Barony. I've been a Senior Marshal for something along 8 to 12 years now. I've had input on Kingdom and Society rules, and I've taught equipment inspection for multiple years. If each person wants to introduce themselves and kind of what their experience is and what they're looking to get from the class. Starting with Margaret.
Yes, I am Margaret Palmer. I am a junior target marshal, archery marshal, and I would like a refresher from last summer.
And Alaric. We can't hear you. I see your mouth moving. I see a confused look. Nothing.
Nope.
Okay, we will let Alaric take a moment to try and get his microphone working. Oh, he left. He's probably rebooting to try and get things going. Okay. So like I said, since I know well, he's back. Maybe? Nope. And I'm not good enough at lip reading. I could tell you said okay after we said no, but I can't read the rest, so.
Can you hear
That's
me
what
now?
There we go.
I had my headphones plugged in.
Okay, so it was looking at the wrong source. Makes sense. Okay, so if you'd introduce yourself.
I'm Alaric, Baron of Wywood. Archery is kind of my barony's life. I would like to know more.
Okay. And I should specify, since this may be shared interkingdom, that at this point in time, all the attendees are from Ontario, where we have a TAM system where we have junior and senior. I know some kingdoms have just one level of marshal. So it's our expectation to be a junior that you can do just really simple equipment inspections. So usually that's just like takedowns or recurves, be able to look it over. Anything complicated, call over a senior or call over someone more experienced. To become a senior, we want you to have learned how to do the other inspections of, the longbows, the horse bows, crossbows, the more kind of specific stuff. And so this class is actually set up to go through all of those things to get people exposed. So to start out with, we will look at recurves because that is the most common bow type that we see. I'm relying on Avina in the background to tell me if people can see what I'm showing or not. So here's a standard recurve. It is a one piece, so the limbs, everything is essentially one piece. It's laminated. But as opposed to having limbs that you can take off or having a socket that comes apart in the middle, which would be called a takedown recurve. So in a one piece, the things we want to inspect are, if it is laminated, which this is, and I'll show a picture later of a close-up of what I mean by laminated, you want to look literally up and down both sides of each limb and where it joins what they call the riser, which is where the grip and the arrow rest are. And you want to see if you see anything separating. If you see anything separating, that can become a delamination very quickly. And a delamination is not a fun thing for the bow or the archer that was trying to shoot the bow. It can be as simple as the limb just crumpling and flexing, or the limb literally snapping off and coming back and possibly hitting the archer or someone else nearby. Again, I have pictures of that coming up too. So we check the sides all the way along to see if we see any signs of delamination or any signs of any gouges or anything that could be compromising the structure of the limb when it flexes. We look along the front and the back or the belly of the bow for any cracks in this case with it laminated in the fiberglass, or in the wood. The biggest concerns are usually ones going across the limb because that's a stress point and that's going to allow it to snap. Any that are lengthwise that are kind of long or that are like down near the tips are also concerns. If you see bare bows, like the real original bare bows, not whoever makes them now, their glue was so strong that it literally caused cracks in every bare bow I've seen, right from the riser onto the first part of the limb, because the fiberglass couldn't shift and move and adjust with the flexing, so it cracked. That's safe. But again, if you see sideways, if you see a very long one that goes down into the limb, if you see anything from like the tip of the limb that's cracking back towards the bow, and I have a picture of one that's doing that, that can be a problem because you can literally have the string and the bow pull out and this just stay straight, just rip up. And so the whole limb will kind of rip down the middle, as it were, and fail. You want to check on the tips. Again, I'm not sure how close this is showing.
A little
Too
over,
close.
a little more towards you. There you
Yes.
go.
Okay. So on the tips, you have grooves where the string sits. You want to check those for a couple things. One is you don't want them to be sharp because you're going to break the strings. And the other is, as I was just mentioning, you want to look for any cracks around that area that could cause the tip to break off or cause cracks down. And you want to check both sides. And I will note, oh, this one doesn't have it, so I'll show you in the photo. A lot of recurves actually have what you call a string groove on the back. And that helps you check for limb straightness when we get to that point. On the riser, what you're looking for, this one's actually one solid piece of wood, so it's unlikely to happen, but you would look for any cracks, if they stored it in the garage and put stuff heavy on it and under it and around it, and it might have forced it and caused a crack through the wood. You'll see on a lot of these where the riser is actually two pieces of wood, and so there will be a joint usually right about where the edge of the cutout is. And so what you can have happen is you can have the shelf literally start to pull away from the rest of the bow because of that joint. That would not necessarily be a bow failure, but I would certainly recommend they try and clamp and glue it or something to address the issue, because it's going to be awfully weird to shoot if that peels down. And again, if that actually does go down and become part of the limb, then it actually could be a bow failure if it's in line with the limb. Arrow rest, not going to go into too much about what we do and don't allow because that was in the TAM class. But you want to check and make sure arrow rest is on tight and not coming loose. Not sometimes you'll see on these plastic ones, black arrow rest on a black shirt. That helps. Not sure how well you can see this, but basically the arrow rest comes out and then has an angle up to keep the arrow sitting on the rest. What I've seen with a lot of the different types of plastic ones is that angle up that helps hold the arrow there will wear off. And so again, if the archer's aware and they're comfortable shooting it that way, not a safety issue, but generally that's a sign it should be replaced, because what you're going to end up with is a lot of times where they draw it, and they keep fighting with the arrow sliding off the arrow rest, and they have to keep resetting it. So inconvenience, not a safety issue. If they shoot off the shelf, they should have something that builds up the shelf. Usually there's a little piece of carpet. There may be a feather rest that's glued onto the shelf. If they have like felt or something, there's usually also an underpiece that pushes up from the bottom and out from the bow so that the arrow itself is not right against the bow, because otherwise when the fletches hit, you're pushing the fletches into the back of the bow as opposed to letting them move past the bow. So if you see any kind of padding on the shelf, you want to kind of feel for or see if you can see a bit of a riser and a push bump that help keep the arrow out where it should be. So once you've checked all that, then you have the person string it up. I unfortunately don't have a string on this one. When they string it up, what I do is I'm looking down from limb to limb and following the string, and the string should essentially go across the center of the bow, which means it should go right through the edge of the cutout if it's straight. If the limbs are twisted, you might see that it's kicking off to one side or the other, or I've had some where they somehow were twisted opposite just exactly. So right at center, they actually went over right where they needed to, but it went to that side on top and to that side on bottom. So limb twist is something you want to watch for. It can be safe to shoot and it can be dangerous to shoot depending on the severity. That's where if they have the channels or the grooves for the string, it helps you. Because what I do is if I see a sign of limb twist on a one piece, I'm going to take it, I'm going to draw it a few times, and I'm going to look again and I'm going to see if the string is traveling. If the string is even further away from center after I draw it, it's not going to be safe for them to shoot because it's going to flip around the bow. If it stays in place and it's, right next to the channel, then I warn them, make sure they know about it, and say, yeah, go ahead. It's safe to shoot as long as you know about it and you keep an eye on it and make sure it's not changing. Then the string itself is the next thing to inspect. If the string's worn around the edges where it might be frayed or ready to break, which again, as we mentioned earlier, could be a sharp spot on the tip or could just be an old string after a lot of wear that it's starting to fail. In the center, we like to have what we refer to as a serving, which I know Margaret's aware of. I think Alaric knows, and I'll share some photos in a bit. We want the serving to be there. The serving is a lot cheaper to replace than the string. If someone insists on shooting off the bare string, they are certainly welcome to do so. It is more likely then, though, that knocking and shooting is going to wear the string and cause the string to fail. Because if it's a continuous loop string, one string fails, the whole string is bad. If it's a Flemish twist, a lot of them are frankly overmade. We tend to make them about 8 to 12 strands, and they're about 40 pounds per strand, supposedly. So in theory, you could do a one-strand string for most of our bows and shoot it that way. I wouldn't. But what that means is if you have 8 or 12 strands and you see that one of them's frayed, it's probably still safe to shoot. If you're seeing that there's a sign that like it's cutting through or something and, a quarter of the string is bad, then I would say, no, you can't shoot that. If you see it fraying through here, one thing you can do is recommend serving if it's not served, to say, hey, we might be able to extend the life of the string if we put serving on there for you. If it's continuous loop, there's serving at each end also, and you want to inspect that and see if the serving's good or not. I have a photo of one where the serving is pulled away and you can see the string is starting to wear from the edge of the bow. So that's one that we're going to actually have to replace. So fraying. Another thing you can recommend on the string, if it feels really dry and looks like it's kind of starting to fray, is that they wax their string. That can help prolong the life of it. Again, not a safety issue, but it certainly is helpful. Okay, I think that covers everything on a standard recurve. I am going to now sit down. I'm going to share some photos which are going to show some of what we talked about and move on to takedown recurves. Okay, so takedown recurves, which are the same thing as what I showed you. It's just that they come apart, which is easy for transport, easy for storage. They tend to be less expensive. So we see a lot of them with newer archers because it's the thing that's affordable to get active within archery. Takedown like the one pictured is probably $110 to $125 brand new. Whereas the recurve I was showing you was probably $150 or up. So again, inexpensive way to get into it, see if you like it, start figuring out what you really want and moving on from there. So inspecting, you're looking at the same things. These are almost always laminated. So you're checking the sides, you're checking the limb tips. The risers on these, again, tend to be one piece of wood, but you're still looking for any cracks or anything that shows that the wood is separating or failing. Same thing with if they shoot off the shelf, same thing with the arrow rest, it's all the same type. The one big difference is these have some sort of mechanical connection in this case. There are some that use a socket, and that's a different situation. But for most of the takedown recurves, they use a mechanical connection. So they have a bolt, or they have, on the simple styles, they have screw-in bolts like this. A lot of the high-end ones have a hex Allen wrench screw-in bolt that they use to adjust the limb height, and then the limb literally slides onto that and then goes down onto a pin, and then the string holds it all together. And so they don't actually screw into place. They're compression fit essentially. But same idea on both of them. You want to check out where that bolt or connection is, make sure it is secure. If you string it up and you think you see limb twist, which again is where the one limb is pulling the string off center. So usually they twist down kind of just before the tip is where we tend to see them develop twist. Anyway, if you see limb twist on a takedown, the first thing to do is unstring it, take it apart, put it back together, string it back up, and try again. Because I've seen situations where the serving on the string has locked itself basically on the tip, and so it's pulling the tip rather than giving way and shifting. I've seen ones where the limb didn't quite lock into place, and so it was a little bit off center in the bow, and so it presents like limb twist when really it was that the bow was not quite put together correctly. A lot of these channels should be designed to not have any play in them, and some of them have some play, and so you can end up with your limb just slightly at an angle, which then with the string on it looks like limb twist. Okay, let's see. And there's a close-up of what I'm referring to on this, which is the most common type of locking bolt in the plastic or metal. I've seen the channel there be metal also on, again, some of the higher end takedowns. And the limb literally just slides into it up to the top, and then you put the bolt through the limb and screw it into the nut that's embedded in the wood. And there's a close-up of the limb tip, and the reason I wanted to show this is that this is what you would call a built-up limb tip. So you notice the white fiberglass is the actual limb, and then it has this segment of wood on it. Now, most of the ones that have a built-up tip, if that tip is missing, the bow is still fine because it has nothing to do with the way the bow flexes. It's designed to try and help round the area where the string goes around the bow. And in some cases, it's just for looks because it, makes the bow look prettier. So if that's missing, it's inconvenient, but as long as the fiberglass underneath is solid, that it's not an issue from the inspection standpoint. As opposed to this type, which is the type I was showing you where there's no buildup, it's just literally flat all the way to the end. There's what I was referring to on it having a string channel. They have these grooves, and some will have the whole Y shape like this does. Sometimes I've seen them just have a bit of a channel down a ways from the limb just for the string to be centered. But that can really be a useful tool, as I mentioned, for telling if the string is shifting as it gets pulled, which helps you find limb twist. And there's a close-up of what I mean by lamination. You'll notice that there are at least 3 layers of wood and 2 layers of fiberglass on that bow. And so you're looking for any sign that any of those layers are separating when you're checking the sides. Bows can be just 2 pieces. They can have no lamination. A lot of old flat bows and a lot of the long bows especially that you learn to make in classes tend to be a single, what they would call a stick bow. It's 1 piece of wood, no lamination. So on those, you're literally just looking for cracks or anything faulty with the wood. And there's a close-up showing that build-up, which again is just literally glued onto the tip. Okay, there is a view of the string I was referring to. You notice the serving has gaps in a couple places. And in one of them, the string is still at least rounded, and the other one, the string is flat, which suggests to me that the string is probably fraying and breaking right there. So we're going to actually be replacing that string as soon as we get an opportunity to. Okay, and here is a Flemish twist string. So you notice that there's twist all along the string. There's extra twist on the ends. This style string has no knots in it. It literally folds back and twists on it back into itself to hold itself together. As such, you would expect to see some sort of fraying or what looks like string ends along the bottom of where the loop was made. And that's because it is string ends. You literally have each string ending a little bit different place usually. This one was probably machine made or at least factory made, and so looks like they got all the string ends right in the same spot and cut them. But yeah, so what you'll often see, and again, if you see them sticking off the string too much, that's another sign they may need to wax their string. But generally, unless you see the twist unraveling, it's not a safety issue. The center up here, which ironically is the top of the screen, that section is what we referred to as the serving. It has a small thread that's wrapped around it for a distance that the knock bead can go onto. That's where you tend to grab it when you draw to shoot. That's where the arrow knocks. And that's because it's a lot cheaper to replace that length of material rather than the whole string. And making strings is not as easy as wrapping a material around it fast and tying it off or gluing it off. Let's see, bead knocks, knock beads. Notice there's one on this string. We only allow one in on tier. I do not recall off the top of my head if that's actually a society rule. The reason is we used to have people who would occasionally put 2 knock beads on. Well, what that does is that forces your arrow to be knocked in the same exact place every time, which is an advantage over people who aren't doing that. So our rules don't allow that. Now they can use a knock bead, they can use a tie-on piece of string for marking their knocking location, but they cannot use multiples. So if you see that, and I actually saw that on one event from an experienced archer, I had to say, hey, you're going to have to remove one of those. Close up of those strings, again, showing that there is visible section of fraying, but that's actually the string end and is actually perfectly safe. Let's see. So we've discussed recurves. We've discussed takedown recurves. This bow is also a recurve. It is a fiberglass. It is a common style to see, especially for kids, because 15, 25 bucks and you have a bow. The particular one I'm sharing a photo of is an older style. Most of the new ones are either a solid green, solid red. They're usually a very solid color. Whereas if you can look at this, I'm not sure how well it shows in this photo, but it's different shades of yellow. You can see lines and stuff in the yellow because of when it was made and the way the dye process was at the time for fiberglass. Oh yeah, you can see it here. Here's a close-up of what I was referring to. If you look on the right side, coming straight down from the cutout for the string, there's actually a crack that follows the line color variation on the bow. This one almost got sold to somebody until we realized that that's actually a crack. That's not just the line coloring from the dye in the fiberglass. So that is now part of my class materials because it's hard to see in it, but if you run your fingernail over it, you'll literally feel it kind of crack and you'll feel your nail dig into it. So you know it's a crack and not just a color line. Horse bows, another type of recurve. Inspecting these is frankly a lot easier. They have the ends, the wood sections are called sias. They can be in all kinds of different shapes. They can have a pronounced elbow. They can be almost straight. They're solid wood. So same thing, you'd look at anything wood, you're just looking for signs that it's cracking. Where the thread is located above each sia and on each side of the handle is primarily what you can inspect on these bows. And what you're looking for is if that thread is loose. If you feel anything loose in those joints, because that's literally the joint where it switches from wood to fiberglass, back to wood, back to fiberglass, and back to wood. So the fiberglass is, in all cases I've seen, covered with the leather. If you don't see leather over the limb, that would be a safety concern, because if it splinters and it's not covered, it can go pretty much any direction. If the leather's there, there's no reason to inspect that part. It's covered. If it does fail, it's ultimately the archer's responsibility. Society has made sure that's in the rules. So we can't make them pull the leather off so we can check out the fiberglass and make sure it's in good shape. So our primary thing is the wood and the joints and making sure the handle is Actually, even the handle, you can't really inspect much because everyone I've seen, the handle's fully covered usually. Sometimes you can see the wood of the handle, so you would again check that for any signs of cracking. And then same thing with the string. You're looking at the ends in case it's fraying. You're looking in the middle in case it's fraying. And then you're having them string up and making sure. Horse bows can be a little trickier to tell if it's off center or not because they don't all have like any channel or anything that the string sits in. This particular one does. If you look right where the Sia angles towards the bow, there happens to be just a little groove in there to make that angle easier on the string, so it's not going to wear the string. And so that on this particular one, that gives you help with checking to see straightness. But I've seen some where they almost look like a longbow. They don't touch other than where they wrap around and go through the string hole. And so same thing, you're looking at it from end to end, trying to see if you see any twist. You're drawing it a few times and checking to see if the string stayed in place or if it moved. And there it is strung up. So this gives you a better idea of what I mean. On the Sias, you can see where the string loop comes down and then it's kind of hidden a bit and then it goes across. So there's a little bit of a channel right there to keep the string centered. And what you can see here is how much curve it has. And these are mostly designed to be drawn up to 32 inches. So they're designed for these limbs to be hugely flexible. So if you see someone drawing one, and you're worried about the bow as far as like if you're calling a range or on a range and you see one just at this, it's kind of surprising how well these things bend and flex to accommodate drawing for 32 inches. So horse bows, that's expected behavior. Here is another recurve. I told you I'd share. You might notice there's something not quite right with it above the handle. And you'll see that there are cracks in the fiberglass along the limb. So not across like we would normally be concerned with, but coming up from the riser, which would be a concern. And there it is in both pieces. So this particular bow, I was there when this happened. We were at Glimmer at Honey War. We were shooting a York, and now Baron Bjorn, when we moved from the 100-yard to the 80-yard, steps up to the line, and I think I'd shot 1 or 2 shots, and I just hear this crackle, 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 snap. And it's like, that was not a good sound. What just happened? And I look over, and he's holding the bottom of the bow, and the top is kind of dangling from the string. It literally, so it lasted all through 12 ends at 100 yards, and then when we went to the 80, it just suddenly delaminated and then snapped. So this falls under the we can't catch everything. Some faults or failures are hidden until they happen, and it is ultimately the equipment owner's responsibility, much as we are trying to provide a service and trying to catch things for them so they don't encounter a bow breaking in their hands. Longbow. Same things we've just discussed with horse bow, with recurve bows. If it's laminated, you'll notice in this picture we have 2, they're different lengths. The top one actually curves and then kind of curves back out away from the camera. So technically that is a mild version of what they would refer to as a reflex deflex longbow, which means it the limbs curve both directions like a recurve, just not nearly as exaggerated as a recurve. That happens to also, if you look at it, have a cutout for a not center shot, but a cutout in a shelf. So that is not a period longbow. It is a longbow category only bow Whereas the one below it, you have to shoot off your hand, so you could shoot that you could decide whether to shoot period arrows and shoot period longbow or shoot regular longbow. Both have Flemish twist string, so again, on these, you're looking at the same things. If it's laminated, is the lamination good? The limb tips, is there any sign of cracking or any sharp edges that could be ruining the string? String it up, is it straight? Do you see any problems with the wood around the riser, which is extra small on the longbow? In fact, some of them barely have one, like the period one here, or some of them actually don't. I've seen some where it's literally just all part of the same width as the rest of the bow limb. So again, with the wood one, you're just looking to make sure there are no weird cracks, dings, nicks that could cause it to split and fail. So the nice thing about equipment inspection, once you learn recurves, it pretty much applies across the rest of them, the bow types, hand bow types. It's just some weird little things that are different. There's a close-up again showing you that the one has the cutout shelf, and if you look, you can see what I mean about that one's the top longbow. It's shoot off the shelf, so it has a pad that's glued on, but within the pad, if you look closely, you can actually see there's just a little bit of a buildup, and that's helping to keep the arrow pushed slightly up and away from the bow to make it so the fletches aren't driving themselves into the back of the bow every time you shoot. Crossbow. Yay. We have different styles of crossbow. A lot of the ones in on tier, frankly, have been made by Wren, and they're the same style. But there are some different makers and some different types out there. Most of them have what they call a roller nut. Some of them, the one on the right here, you'll see a close-up of this later, has a clap lock. We have types that is literally just a wood peg that as you pull the trigger, the peg pushes the string up out of the channel, and as soon as it clears the channel, it fires, which is probably the simplest mechanism for a crossbow. We have, when it comes to crossbow inspection, you want to inspect where the string goes to make sure that there's nothing loose or weird that would let the string come off unevenly. Because if it comes off unevenly, you're not in control of which direction the bolt goes. You want to look at the prod. You want to make sure the prod's secure. And that can vary crossbow to crossbow. These two both use bow irons, so you can literally wiggle it, see if it's loose, and if it's loose, we can grab hammers and pound the wedges in to tighten it. You've probably seen somewhere they use like an artificial sinew or a linen or some sort of wrap to wrap through the body and around the prod to lock the prod in place. Can't do much about those if they feel loose. Warn them and tell them if they're not safe, but there's really no quick, easy fix. They're probably going to have to go unwrap it and rewrap the thing to get it tight enough, or they might need to wet the sinew down and let it dry, because a lot of times that'll tighten the material and pull it. These have stirrups. You don't have to have a stirrup. These have crossbow fingers, bolt pinches, trying to think of all the names I've heard. It's the piece that goes over the clap lock or roller nut or the string, the mechanism that holds the string, and it literally is a spring that kind of clips the bolt in place. What that does is allow you to ensure that the bolt's going forward when the string hits it and pushes it, rather than up in the air or something like that. I recommend having them. They are not by on-tier or society rules required. If you see one, you want to make sure the bolt fits under it. It shouldn't be so hard that they have to like pry it to slide the bolt under every shot, because it's going to be hard on the bolt. It's going to potentially cause damage to the bolt if it's pinching that hard. And it's also going to slow down their shooting. It's going to bring into question, if they do a timed end, is their equipment really okay for that? And most of these you can bend. So if they have tools, or if they have strong enough hands, they can usually bend them a little bit, more open or closed, to fit the bolt accordingly. What I've found is, again, since they're not required, it's up to the shooter, but oftentimes you want it set so it just touches the bolt, because otherwise you can be forcing the front end of the bolt up unintentionally, which will mess with shots, and that's not safe. Let's see. Okay, so you'd inspect the stock for any cracks. You'd make sure the trigger is okay. You would make sure whatever mechanism locks the string allows the string to be locked and is not a hair trigger. May have seen an episode of, I think it was Forged in Fire, where they had the competitors make crossbows, and when Dave Baker picked one up to test it, it fired before he put his hand on the trigger. That's not a safe situation. So if they have any kind of risk of a hair trigger, that I would not allow that on the range. And make sure the prod's tight. I think that covers. You'll notice these have grooves for the crossbow bolts to set in. They should have something for the bolt. I've seen where people cut the deck lower and then they put like pegs, or just like two little spots where it's a little grooved out raised piece of wood, so that the bolt kind of sits, but it reduces the friction on it. As long as the bolt's going to stay in place when they put it there until they pull the trigger, that's what we're looking for. Here's a close-up. So the one in the foreground is a clap lock. So literally the string pulls into it and then pushes down into the body, into those grooves, and that causes that plate to click down and lock in place on the trigger. And then when you pull the trigger, it just pops that plate up and lets the string go. Top one's a roller nut. The string literally hooks on the back end, and then when you pull the trigger, it lets that roller nut spin free, which lets the string loose and shoot. So one difference on the mechanism is the roller nut you have to lock in place before you pull the string. The clap lock, the string, pulling the string and setting it is what locks the trigger in place. So when you're inspecting them, clap lock, you can dry fire. So go ahead and push it down, make sure it locks down, pull the trigger, make sure that releases it. Roller nut, what I do to test is I'll lock it in place, I'll put just a little finger pressure, and then when I'll pull the trigger and I'll make sure that it lets it loose, and then I'll also give the roller nut a spin, because it should spin fairly freely. Every once in a while you'll see someone who's put sinew through the bottom, and they've designed it so it literally lets loose just enough to let the string go, but then when they pull the string, they can lock it back into place so they can shoot faster, which again is allowed. Okay, one thing I did want to show, on the prods, you'll notice on the one on the right, there's a leather wrap that covers about half of the prod. On the one on the left, you can't see it, and I didn't think about that, but I will show you some examples of some broken ones in a moment where you can see. There is heat shrink tubing across the center for about a 3-inch area. One of the rules I did influence in the SCA archery and had discussions and convinced them they should put in place is that when prods break, it's normally right at the edge of the crossbow body, because that's where all the stress is when it flexes. I've had one break pretty much dead center. I've had 1 out of 13 break in 2 places. Every other one is broken in one place, and it's been right at the edge of the crossbow body. And having the heat shrink tubing or a leather wrap or a lace that wraps around, that goes the length of the prod and wraps around every couple inches or something, anything that will prevent it from flying and causing injury is required now. The exception is if you have something like one of those ones that's put in with artificial sinew, it's awfully hard and complicated to take the prod off to put something on it. They have grandfathered those in so that at such time as you replace the prod, you need to add on the new prod something that covers the center area of the prod. Okay, so we showed that. Crossbow string is continuous loop. If anyone shows you a Flemish twist crossbow string, challenge them. I don't care how well it's made. I cannot believe that something that is not tied back to itself securely can handle the forces that a crossbow puts on those strings. So continuous loop is literally, this is all one strand that under one of the ends, one of the loop ends, the two ends of the blue string are actually tied in a knot, and then the serving is put over to help reinforce holding that knot together. And then the ends are served and the middle's served so that the ends, because it wears on the metal, and the center, same reason you do it for a handbow string, that's where it runs along the deck, that's where it pushes the crossbow bolts. So replacing a section of serving is easier than wearing the string out and replacing it. Let's see, and there's a close-up, so you'll notice this string, I actually have an area on the end where the serving is parted, and those are in question now, especially that bottom section looks like it's fanned out a little bit, which means I'm betting I have at least one broken strand in there. And since it's continuous loop, one broken strand means the whole string's broken. I can still shoot it if I dare. But I know that at some point that's going to give way and the string's going to fly downrange and sit on the ground, and I'm going to have to go find another string to shoot. So really, unless I'm like nearing the end of a scoring round and I need to just finish, that's going to be replaced. Okay, before we go on to this part, let me stop sharing that, which should switch hopefully back to the video. Sorry, I know it's me. Okay. Crossbow prods. So this is what I was referring to. I grabbed one with the red so that you can easily see the heat shrink. Too close?
I have nothing on video.
Okay, I'm hearing you have nothing on video.
Yeah, I've got a frozen screen. Oh, now I have you.
Is there now?
Yes.
Okay, so it took a while to switch from photos to live. Okay. So, crossbow prod, I picked one that has the nice bright red so you can easily see what I was talking about with having heat shrink. And what you can't really see on this is the place I get these from actually puts a thing of heat shrink on there. I put a second one on there. That second one has saved me several times when this happens. I've had times where there's literally just one or two threads of the second piece holding that prod that kept it from flying. When it breaks, like I said, right next to the body, if you look at this, the crossbow body sits right here. And so it broke right on the edge. And that was enough to hold it. The one time I have had that not be enough to hold it, like I said, I had one that broke in two spots. So if you look at this one, it actually broke on this end and on this end. And this one was able, because it was just under the edge of the second heat shrink tubing, was able to fly free. Thankfully, it was the on range side, so it flew down range like 5 feet. and this side held. So when these break, what normally happens, it's every time I've done it and had one break, it's been when I'm drawing the string, preparing to shoot, because that's when you're starting to apply the force. And it comes up, it wraps me across the knuckles, I complain, and I put the crossbow away. So again, that was part of my reason for the rule was that I've seen it, 12 out of 13 times completely stop the prod from flying when it's broken. And so I push that really is a good idea for safety to make sure that there's some sort of wrap to prevent that flying from happening. Okay, so I think we've gone through. One thing I can do quickly is I can try and show you a little more close up of what they call the bow irons, which they have the side metal plate, and then they have, let's see if you can tell it all. Sorry, trying to tell what it can show on my camera and not if I get my face out of the way. So these pieces, literally these ends are cut out pieces to lock these in place. And then the center two are wedges that you set in place. You get all this centered, and then you pound these in with a hammer to tighten it all up, and that pulls this backward to lock this against the body, which is why that's the stress point and why that's where the failure is most likely to happen. Here's another view of what I was referring to as the crossbow finger. So it's aligned with the groove so that the bolt slides under it. And I didn't really explain, I said they had stirrups. This is the stirrup. So this is used if you hook it on your foot to string it. That's what that is for. Okay, so we have covered recurves, longbows, horsebows, crossbows. I believe we are on to arrows. So arrows can have pretty much any type of fletching. I'm going to go back to showing pictures now if this works. Do we see pictures now?
Yes.
Okay. So this first photo is a picture of some different types of tips that you might encounter on arrows. The one on the left is a crimp-on blunt nose, usually on kids' arrows, usually inexpensive arrows that you can pick up at Cabela's or something to get kids started in archery. They are allowed. Whenever I see them, I try and kind of keep an eye on the kid and their shooting and what their skill level is, because if they're at the point where they're hitting the target much, a lot of our targets, those may tend to bounce out, at which point I might offer them loner arrows to use instead so they can get that sense of, hey, I'm hitting things, they're sticking, this is cool. And I might kind of chat with their parents about some options on, getting different arrows or what to replace the tips. The second one over is a standard glue-on field tip. This is what you'll see on almost everyone's arrows or crossbow bolts. It is tapered at the front. That helps provide friction and slow it down when it goes into the target. It literally does glue on, so the wood is tapered and is glued into that. If someone says, hey, I made my first set of arrows, that might be a cue to ask them how they attached the tips. If they say something like super glue or, a crafting glue gun, there's not going to be a safety issue, but I would warn them they are probably going to lose tips when they start shooting and having to pull these out of bales. What we use is a high temperature hot melt glue that we use either a torch or an alcohol burner or something to melt the glue. And that seems to be the stuff that works the best for our climate and for, especially during summer months, keeps it from overheating and softening and losing tips in the target butts. The next tip over is a modified bodkin. This particular one is of a style that a marshal can say, no, you can't shoot that on the range. The reason I say that is the bulb on the tip is larger in diameter than the arrow shaft. What that means is only the part of the target butt that front cone hits is providing friction to stop the arrow. They were literally designed for the arrow to just provide the weight and force to keep pushing the tip through whatever it hits. So the marshal has the right by the rules in on tier to say that will cause excessive target damage and you are not allowed to use it. They also have the right to say, you know what, yeah, that's cool, and the targets we use, we're not worried about it, go for it. So be aware if you have them, you will need to check each site before you shoot them. And if you see them on an inspection, you should ask whoever the marshal in charge is to see if they are allowing them or not, because that one does come down to essentially the whoever is providing the target bells and that deciding if it'll cause too much damage. The next one over is what you'll hear referred to as a brass bullet tip because of the bullet type shape to it. Those can be screw-on or glue-on. They are perfectly legit. They are the same diameter as the arrow shaft. The one on the far right is a screw-on version of a field point. So again, it's tapered and it is not sticking out any from what the diameter of the arrow shaft is, so it is also allowed. One thing you would want to check when checking an arrow is give a quick twist on the tips, see if they are secure or loose. Another thing you'll check, which I'll go over also in a little bit, is sometimes cracks happen right along the tip. So you won't notice that your shaft is actually cracked in from the edge of the tip and then maybe up a little bit along a grain. And so I'll show you a trick a little bit later for helping to catch if that happens. Here's another interesting one. The tip on top is actually a bird blunt. So it has absolutely no tip. So if someone, you know, were to show up and say, yeah, Grandpa gave me his arrows and I want to shoot, that's the only way I could see ever encountering this. I mean, I've only seen this one, which was given to me. So you're not likely to encounter them, but the only way I could see if you did is if someone were a birder and they, you know, here, have my arrows since you're interested in archery kind of situation. In that case, obviously what we'd want to do is try and provide them loaner arrows and let them know that those actually can be removed and replaced. Just have to work with someone who makes arrows, or, you know, if they're competent doing it, they could order the right tips and glue them on. Here's a close-up of two versions of a modified bodkin. The one on the left is allowed because the bulb there does not exceed the diameter of the arrow shaft. And the one on the right is the one we already saw where it does. So just to let you see a couple different types of a modified bodkin. So here's some different types of arrows. You'll notice different colors, different fletchings. Some have the entire shaft dyed a color, some the entire shaft's natural wood color, all kinds of different shapes. We'll go into some of those in a moment, right here. So you'll see from the top down, you'll see two arrows with shield shape with different lengths. You'll see one, the red and blue, with what I would call a back cut. They took a full feather and then they cut it so it angles backwards rather than the shield shape that kind of goes forward on the cut. You'll see two that are what you refer to as a parabolic fletch, and the bottom is a flu, so that's a full height feather cut to length for the arrow. All of these are legal. The thing we do not allow is plastic vanes like you might see on someone's compound arrows, so carbon, aluminum, fiberglass arrows. Also on this shot, you'll see most of these have plastic glue on nocks. The one dead center is actually, the nock is part of the shaft, so that's actually a period style arrow. It has what's referred to as a self nock, where the nock is cut into the arrow shaft rather than being a glued on separate thing. You'll also notice the second from the top, you'll see a little bit of shadow there. So that one has what's referred to as an index, which is a little bump on one side of the nock, which usually aligns with the third or the cock feather, so that you can quickly feel as you're grabbing it which side goes up on the bow or goes towards you, to help you, when people get used to using that as a sensory thing, it helps them load faster during timed ends. Okay, I think that's it for that one. These are two different types of flus. The one on the right, they've trimmed the fletch or the feather down somewhat, but it's still longer than you would typically see on a standard arrow. And it also twists around the shaft quite a bit. These flus are typically used in birding arrows, but they're also used in a lot of like novelty shoots because they provide plenty of drag, so that the arrow isn't going to go super far. So they help limit distance, make it easier to find. So they're used on a lot of things like 3D shoots, Popinjay, things like that, where they want to be able to quickly and easily find it. This particular one, I can actually show you in a minute also. You'll notice this looks like it's either two fletch or something's weird with the fletching. And if you look here, you can see it actually has another fletch on the back side. So it's actually two white and one black fletch, but there's no fletch on the right side. What this is it's set up as a double shot arrow. And what I will do quickly, assuming this works, is I will switch back to the camera, hopefully, and I will show you. So for a double shot arrow, the idea is you use a 4 fletch jig and you only do 3 of the fletches, and you align them so that when they're knocked on the string, they can sit right against each other. What that does is make it so your double shot is going to be more consistent and hit the target about the same area, whereas if they have a fletch pushing them apart, when they fly, they're going to go spread out more and be less predictable. So you'll see occasionally when people do double shots to start their timed ends, they will specifically fletch their arrows to accommodate that. Perfectly legit and legal. Let's see. Let me figure out what the next picture was, and if I wanted to go back to it. I'll just actually explain this one with an arrow I have here. 4 fletch. So most of us use 3 fletch, but occasionally people use 4. Trying to show it on the camera without being too blurry. Perfectly legal. You can have 2, 3, or 4. It's the archer's choice. Doesn't really impact anything other than on a timed end, I can knock it either direction because it's going to fly the same way off the bow. So some people use it for that just because they don't have to care what direction the arrow is when they knock it. Okay, so that's 4 fletch. We already discussed the, So when inspecting, let me share this photo fast. Period nocks. We already discussed self knock, which is where it's cut in. Society has recently decided to allow these new hardwood glue-on nocks. So they're tapered and glue on just the same way the plastic ones do, but they're made out of hardwood, so they're actual wood, and they have a cut in just like you have for a self knock. So if you see those are now allowed per society. It took a little while to get a ruling on that, but as soon as they did, I made a set, and I know several others have, because it's like, oh, cool. I don't have all the stuff to, do the inserts and the self knocks, but I can glue a tapered knock onto anything. So yeah. And that's one of the reasons they chose to allow it, is to try and encourage more people to get into the period side of shooting of equipment. And this helps to do that. So before I show that, I will switch back to the camera. Maybe camera. Okay. So like I was mentioning, you want to see if the tip's loose. You want to see if it's a glue-on knock, if the knock's loose. You just give a little twist, see if it comes off. We had one set that a kid bought at a merchant at the event, comes over to the archery range, and sure enough, first couple shots, has both knocks fall off, and we're like, well, what's the deal here? And we grabbed the rest of the ones in the quiver and gave a little twist, and every last one came off. They either didn't put enough glue or they used the wrong type of glue, and so the knocks weren't secured. And we thankfully we were able to find them all, and we literally handed them back and said, we recommend you go back to the merchant and let them know they did something incorrectly with this, that these are all coming off. It's an uncommon thing. It is not something that I have encountered since that one event. So I think that merchant has definitely taken the approach of learning the feedback we've given and applying it to what they're making and selling. Okay, so check if that's loose, check if that's loose. Check the fletch, see if fletches are coming off. If fletches are starting to come off, especially in the front end, that can let it dig straight into your hand when you let go of that string. So if you see loose fletch on the front, I would definitely warn them that they're probably going to not want to shoot it. It's their choice. It's not a safety hazard to anyone else. I would certainly express that it could well be a safety hazard to themselves. The other thing I was mentioning a trick. So if you take an arrow from both ends and you gently curve the arrow or flex the arrow and roll it, that can help you hear any crackling, or if there's like a hidden crack here, it can help make it come loose and stick up so that you can see it. So that's a quick way to check to see if there are cracks that you didn't physically spot looking at the arrow. If there's color, it's hard to necessarily tell. If there's bare area, it's easier to kind of do a quick look over and see if you see any cracks. There are some types of faults, such as this one, where someone was using this. This was part of loaner gear, and it literally just broke. And what we saw was, if you look at the wood grain, it had a flaw in the wood grain. All the grain lines in the wood externally are running lengthwise like they should for an arrow, but there was a flaw in the grain, like it maybe had frozen or something and caused a weird growth spot in so the grain went angled and it snapped there when they let go of the string. Some flaws we can't find. Let's see. So now we'll switch to back to some photos of some kind of interesting and weird stuff we've seen over the years. This particular arrow is a completely fiberglass arrow. It's surprisingly heavy, and there's a little hole in the back end right behind the veins. So this has rubber veins on it, so we're already at two things that it wouldn't be allowed for. It's a fiberglass arrow, and it has veins rather than fletches. The hole through this shaft is actually for fishing string. This is a fishing arrow. So the mass and the weight help it fly through the water to hit the fish, and the string helps it to be retrieved. So it's a cool thing I like to show, because frankly, until I had seen this one, I'd never seen one, and most archers haven't. So it's a good thing to, kind of a neat thing just to get to see. Interestingly, you'll also notice the top of this has a little bump out on the nock, so this is indexed. And you'll notice on these vanes, they actually wrap all the way around the shaft, whereas a lot of vanes glue on just like fletches do. So they're usually individual. This is a prize arrow. It looks like an absolutely lovely period arrow that I would never let anyone put on a bow and draw. What we realized on this is if you look carefully, and you especially being a jeweler and being used to looking at details may have already noticed, each of those cool lines is a different grain pattern. So what they did is they butt joined a bunch of sections of wood. So what that means is if you pull the string back and let go, one or all of those is just going to fail when it tries to flex to bend around the bow. And that's disaster waiting to happen. It's really pretty. It's an awesome prize arrow. Don't shoot it. So if you see different color things like that, that's one way to check, is to see if the grain structure looks the same throughout all the different colors. Because if they've done stains to make colors, usually you can still see the grain structure. So that can help you figure out if it's actually still one piece or if it's multiple pieces. This one is kind of an interesting guy. Looks like a normal arrow here. Still looks like a normal arrow pretty much, except if you look really closely at the details, there's this weird repeating pattern that doesn't look like wood grain on this arrow shaft. This person came to our range twice and shot this before we caught on that that's a fiberglass arrow, because it looks like wood, until you get really up close and realize that no, it has these weird marks and lines, which is from the fiberglass. This arrow is a trick in that visually everything about that arrow is legitimate. Obviously you can't see the wood underneath, so you could always ask questions about that to just make sure. But has a standard field tip, has standard fletches, has a glue-on plastic nock. Everything about it looks okay. The person who gave this to me, gave me a set of them to use specifically as prize arrows, let me know that she went to the hobby store and bought a bunch of wooden dowels to practice making arrows. Which means we don't know which direction the grain structure is going on that shaft. So no, it is not safe. And no, I couldn't know that unless she had told me. So I'm glad she did. But that's an example of sometimes, hey, this is cool. How'd you get it? How'd you make it? You know, asking questions as you do an inspection can give you a little more information or a few keys that, oh, I need to check this, or uh-oh, this may not really be as safe as it looks. Crossbow bolts, same things as arrows, and you can do the same thing. You can flex it from each end, or at least you can try to. They tend to be a lot stiffer. They use the same tips, so same thing, modified bodkins, if they're the same diameter, are fine. If they're not, then it's up to whoever's range it is. The difference here is they're almost always two fletch, because they have to sit on the deck of the crossbow, and then they have the backs are almost always flat. And that's because they generally don't knock onto a string, they slide up against the string. And the strings tend to be about 40 strands, so it's this large bundle of string that's pushing the bolt. Occasionally someone will kind of cut a slight notch in the back of theirs for the string to sit in, so it's more of a string groove than a full knock. I've seen some where they actually did design them to have a knock, but those are very, very rare. When I see this, one of the things that I would generally ask is, have you done anything on the back of the bolts? Have you applied some super glue or something to harden the back end? Because it's going to be less likely to split from the force of the string. And if you Robin Hood it, it's going to be less likely to split in a way that makes it unusable. So it's in the archer's interest to have done something to reinforce. If you see a metal cap on the back, that's allowed. Make sure it's secure. It's not allowed to be just pushed on there and then used, because that can fly off at any time. It has to be attached if it's there. Trying to think of what else. If you can look at the back of them. I was thinking I had an example. I don't. You can look at the back of them, and what you want to see is you want the grain to be perpendicular to the fletches, because that way the string is going across all the grains rather than along a grain where it's more likely to be able to cause it to split. As in the example, the one on the far right, which even the end is black, you're probably not going to see the wood grain, so you're going to hope they did it right and maybe talk to them and see if it's something they were aware they needed to watch for when they fletched their bolts. And I believe we have covered everything. Do you have any questions?
No, it was excellently explained. Oh, I do have one
Okay.
question about
Yeah.
the crossbow metal caps.
Okay.
What are we talking about with that? Are we talking like something like a flat thumbtack that's glued on? Are they screw on? Are they flat in place? How are they attached?
Okay, so the type I've seen a couple types, honestly. One was that someone took some, looked like aluminum, and machined it to literally fit as a cap around the end of the bolt and glued it on. And in fact, they gave me that set, and about half of those are missing already when they gave me the set. So not necessarily the most successful approach, but that may have been glue. So again, you want to make sure that they've glued it on so it's not going to just twist and pull off. The other thing I've seen some people do is literally 11/32 happens to align with, I don't think it was 44 caliber. Anyway, it happens to align really well with one of the types of handgun rounds. And so I've seen people, especially where there's a shared range where they have an archery and a gun range at some of the modern sites, they'll go and collect some and glue those on.
Okay.
Because it's a metal cap. That's what it's designed for, is to protect the back end of a thing.
Sure, absolutely.
Just not quite the thing you're putting it on.
Okay.
So that is what we're talking about. I have not seen anyone do like a thumbtack. I would have concerns because you're literally introducing a split in the wood at that point.
Absolutely.
Unless they clipped off the tack part and they just glued the metal cap on the back. It'd be interesting to see how that would work, but I've never seen anyone do that. So does that answer? Okay. Anything else? Alrighty. That wraps this up then. I will hit stop on the record here.